Hi everybody. This is my third attempt to tape this. I've had some technical problems, so hopefully this time it will work. I hope you're all doing okay and enjoying your somewhat enforced time in your homes and with your families. I know at the beginning it's kind of a novelty, and after a bit the kids start climbing the walls, so hopefully you're doing all right. This is kind of a strange time for us, isn't it? It's surprisingly difficult to be cut off from people and be not allowed to go anywhere or interact with people. It's a new way of life for us, isn't it? And there's certainly a lot of people in our world who are pretty concerned and anxious and uptight during this time. There's a lot of anxiety about what this means and how we're going to survive as a society, as a culture, financially, socially, and so on, with what's going on. And so it can be kind of overwhelming. And it certainly has brought up some questions. Some of you have mentioned to Julie and Lisa that you're interested in stuff about the end times and about how the world ends and how this might fit in. We're so used to stability and a normal, safe way of living that this has kind of thrown us a little bit. So as a result of that, we've made a decision to study 1st and 2nd Thessalonians in the upcoming end of our time in Real Mornings for this year. And so we're going to start that. I'm going to give you a little introduction to the book and a little bit about chapter 1 today. There are some discussion questions posted on the Facebook page for Real Mornings as well, and I'd really encourage you to think about those. And then of course you can join your group on Zoom Wednesday morning to talk about it and to have prayer requests and so on. So I was thinking that my generation has had it pretty easy. My grandparents lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. My dad lived through 1 world war and the Great Depression. I remember the Cold War, but that was probably the closest I ever came to any time of real instability. And I also remember the recession of the early 80s when Len and I were first married. A lot of you are probably too young to remember any of those things, or perhaps your parents, you were very small and your parents kept them hidden from you. But really, by and large, we've had it easy. And so how do we put turbulence and uncertainty and pandemics and all of that into perspective as Christians? The letters to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians address this subject, address how to live as we wait for the return of Jesus and how to put the events of life into perspective and have hope while we wait. The second coming of Jesus is in both books, and the church there is being instructed on how to live while they wait for Jesus' return. Their circumstances are different than ours. Their circumstances are much harder than ours. But the instruction for us about how to live as we wait is the same as it was for them. So we're going to look at these books. Paul likely is the primary dictator of this book, but chapter 1, verse 1 mentions that the book is from 3 people, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. And so some people think probably Paul was the primary dictator, Silas wrote the words down and possibly contributed some of it, and Timothy may have contributed as well, but he was probably the one who delivered the book to the church. The first question that you had for thought on the list of questions that were posted for you is to look back at Acts and remind yourself of the history of this church. How did it begin and where did it come from? And we did a quick flyover of this as we went through Acts, but we were going pretty fast, so you might not remember how this church began. Thessalonica is a port city. It was a pretty major city, and it was one of the ones in which the cult of the emperor was very highly regarded. The cult of the emperor is the idea that Caesar is God, and Caesar is worshipped as a god. And Thessalonica was one of the main cities from which that idea came out. But it's also a city with a lot of other pagan religions. They even have found examples there of some Egyptian gods that were worshipped in Thessalonica. There was a synagogue there. We know that from the fact that Paul went to the synagogue when he visited the city and taught there. And that means there was a decent sized Jewish population, because you had to have, I believe it was 10 adult men in order to have a synagogue in a particular city. Paul had been through there on his second missionary journey in probably about 49 AD, and we read about that in Acts 17. And when he was through there for 3 Sabbaths, 3 Saturdays in a row, he went and taught in the synagogue, teaching that Jesus was the Messiah. And some Jews were saved, and it said that some God-fearing Greeks were saved. These would have been people who had some passing understanding of God. They were not polytheistic. They believed in one God. They knew something about the God of the scriptures, but they had none of them had faith in Jesus prior to Paul's teaching. And some of these people had become believers. Opposition arose, and Paul had to leave the city, and it tells us in the first verse of Acts 18, they had to leave in the middle of the night. And it seems as if he had to leave like just a few weeks into his time period there, just 3 weeks in. He tried several times to go back. He wanted to go back and visit this very young baby church, but he was unable to get there. So he sent Timothy back to them. We find that out in 1 Thessalonians, that he sent Timothy there to help them and to teach them because they were such an infant church. And he had a lot of concern for them. At some point, some Gentiles had also come to Christ. It's unclear whether that started when Paul was still there or whether it happened afterward, but it tells us in chapter 1, verse 9, that a bunch of people had turned from idols to faith in the living and true God. That means that they had gone straight from the polytheistic pagan life to Christianity. These were pagan Gentiles, and so the church is growing very, very quickly. Now, Paul might have had a bit of a concern. One of his concerns for this church might have been the fact that there was a lot of skepticism in the Roman world because there were all these traveling guys that would go around and go into towns and try to preach some new thing and claim some new philosophy or some new God and get everybody all worked up and set themselves up as great teachers or orators. And it was all done for the sake of pride or for the sake of money. And then they would disappear. And here's Paul, he's only been there a few weeks and he has to run off in the middle of the night. So he may have had some concerns that they thought he was one of those people. And he's going to address that especially when we get to chapter 2 of this book. He also seems to be addressing a concern that he had heard they had, that they seem to be wondering what would happen in the second coming of Jesus. When Jesus returns, what's going to happen for people, believers who have died? The early church thought they knew Jesus was coming back, but they didn't know how long it was going to take. And I think for the most part, they thought that they would still be alive when he returned. And now there's people dying, maybe even being put to death for their faith, and they're not sure how those people then are going to fit in when Jesus returns. Is there a place for them? What's going to happen? And so Paul addresses that. There's also the faith of these people has been a bit tested. They have been separated from their families. Their families are not thrilled with their faith. They are at odds with their culture. They're seen as undermining the power and authority and stability of the emperor by saying that Caesar is not God. And it says in chapter 1, verse 6, that they are suffering and that it's fairly severe suffering. And Paul is concerned they may not hold on to their faith in the middle of this struggle. So he wrote them a letter in about AD 50, which means he wrote it less than a year, possibly even just a few months after he had been there. So that's the background of 1 Thessalonians. So with that in mind, let's start with chapter 1. In this first short chapter, it's only 10 verses long, Paul emphasizes his thankfulness for this church and for their faith. And he affirms that they have come into something really different from their culture, from what's going on around them in their city. So their separateness from that is not a surprise. He wants them to know that they were formed as a church by God himself. He talks about God having called them. And he wants them to embrace the things that set them apart from their city. And he is thankful for them and for their faith. He says in verse 2, "We always thank God for all of you, mentioning you in our prayers." This church has had a lot of loss. Family, social acceptance, etc., possibly financial suffering, possibly even imprisonment. And Paul shows them that they have left one family behind and one way of life, but they have a new one. They have a new family, and a new way of life. He says God is their Father. He calls them brothers and sisters in verse 4. Their human family may reject them, but God has given them a new one. There are 3 specific things he mentions in his thanksgiving for them. In verse 3, he says, we remember before God your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. In each of these phrases, the emphasis is on the second part. It's on the faith, the love, and the hope. The faith, the love, and the hope are driving the work, the labor, and the endurance. This is a church living its faith. From an internal level, from a character level, it's living its faith. Knowing the struggles that they're in, the writers remind the church to whom they belong. He says in verse 4, God chose them. He shows them the work of God in them in 2 ways. First, the power of the message that was given to them. He says that it did not come to them merely in words, but with the power and convicting of the Holy Spirit. This is something that I sometimes pray for myself when I have to teach, is that God would, that what I'm going to say would not simply be mere words, but the power and life-changing conviction of the Spirit. If you ever have to teach at Hub or at youth or something, or you're doing a Bible study somewhere, that's a good verse to underline as a prayer for yourself. That God would, that the message that would go out from your mouth would not just simply be words, but the power of the Spirit. The second way in which he sees the work of God in them is their response to the gospel, and that's in verse 6. They welcome the message with joy in the Spirit. And they've been living this. They are a model for other churches, and their faith is known all over the region. They've turned from idols to serve the living and true God. They've left the dead and the false, and they've gone to the living and the true. They're also sharing the gospel with others. In verse 8, it says the Lord's message is ringing out from them to the entire region. And they are a church that's waiting for the return of Christ. Now, the return of the Lord, the second coming, is a major theme of the Bible. There are over 1,800 references to it in the Old Testament. And in the 260 chapters of the New Testament, there are 318 references to the second coming. The second coming is the physical return of Jesus to earth. There are 2 parts to it, and both are included in what the Bible calls the second coming. The 2 parts are, first, the removal of believers from the earth, sometimes called the snatching away or the rapture. And the second one is the physical return of Jesus and the judgment of unbelievers and of Satan. In theological terms, both of those, and even the and also the judgment stuff that we see in Revelation that may happen in between them, those things, depending on what you believe about the order of things, all of that is wrapped up theologically in the second coming of Christ, in what's called the second coming. And there are different points of view about the timing of these 2 events, what order they happen in, and how much time is in between them, or whether there's any time in between them and all that. But from a theological perspective, they're all encompassed in the idea of the second coming of Christ, when God is going to bring all human history to a culmination and put all things right and establish himself as king over the universe. The second coming of Jesus has both a blessing component and a judgment component. The blessing component is for believers. Believers will be snatched away or raptured from the earth and taken to meet Jesus in the air. Believers will be with Jesus then forever from then on. All the promises of God for us that he has made to us will be fulfilled forever. We will be done with sin and pain and death and tears and sorrow. We will be perfect. We will be in his presence. This part has to come before the second part, and we'll see that when we get further into the book. But how much before is a question. There are different views on this among Christians. Some people think we will be removed at least 7 years before Jesus comes in judgment. Some think it will be 3.5 years. Some think that Jesus will come, take believers up to the air above the earth, and then basically turn around and bring all of us with him and come immediately back down and appear physically on the earth to judge Satan. the hope of the return of Jesus that the church of Thessalonica is holding on to is this first part, this removal, this snatching away, the rapture of believers from the earth. The second part of the return of Jesus is the judgment portion. And this is his visible, physical, bodily return to earth, to judge all sin, to put an end to the battle the Antichrist will be waging against God and against his people, to rescue Israel, to chain Satan and the beast and throw them in the lake of fire. And a lot of those things we find at the end of Revelation. That's the judgment portion of his return. And again, this has different views among Christians. One is that he will return after 7 years of trouble on the earth called the tribulation, and then we'll put an end to all of that and set up an earthly physical reign from the temple in Jerusalem and reign over the earth. This is when you would see the lion lying down with the lamb and holiness being written on everything, and Jesus would be king. Some people believe that there is no physical return of Jesus and that he already reigns over all things, which in one sense he does. And this view is called the amillennial view, or no millennium, no 1,000-year reign. There are some Christians who believe that Jesus will not come to earth and physically reign on the earth. Others believe that we have to prepare the earth before Jesus is able to come by spreading the gospel to the extent that most people become believers, so that then Jesus can come and take his reign. Southridge does not hold to either of those two views. Southridge would hold to the idea, to the belief in the physical, visible return of Jesus to reign at whatever time he chooses, regardless of the condition of the earth, that he is king, he is God, and he can take control and do what he likes. That there will be then a time of judgment, at the very beginning when Jesus returns, as he has to judge and remove all the unbelievers, chain Satan and the Antichrist. There will be a lot of death, a lot of suffering, and it will all be very terrible for non-believers. This involves some of the things we see, the apocalyptic images that we see at the end of Revelation, which are really kind of hard to read sometimes and a little bit frightening. In Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 3, it talks about our hope in the Lord Jesus. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to think about the judgment portion of the second coming and hope. And sometimes, too, we have a funny idea about the use of the word hope. Hope in our regular English is more wishful thinking. It's like, gee, I hope for Christmas that I get maybe a Jaguar convertible. I'd really like a new one, or a diamond ring. Or I hope it doesn't rain on Saturday because we plan on going to a wedding in the park. That's wishful thinking. That's optimism, but it isn't biblical hope. When you have the word hope in the Bible, it's an anticipated but absolutely certain event. Something you're looking forward to, but that's absolutely for sure. The coming of Jesus is for sure. And we have hope in it. It's something we look forward to, and we know for sure it's going to happen. It provides hope for us in times of trouble because we know we will be with him. We can have hope in both the blessing aspect and the judgment aspect. He's coming for us. We are certain that he's going to put all things right, that anybody who ever went after us, that anybody who ever caused us to suffer, that anyone who ever persecuted us or harmed the church is going to be dealt with. We can leave revenge to God because we have hope that he will put it right. We are confident we're on the winning side. So we can hold on to that certainty in times of struggle or fear, and that's going to inspire us with confidence, with calm faith, and with a positive outlook. And we could certainly use some of that these days, right? The last verse of the chapter is the latter part of a sentence. It says, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus who rescues us from the coming wrath. Now, our current pandemic of COVID-19 is not the coming wrath. The coming wrath will be much worse than what we have going on right now. But we have been rescued from it. We're not going to suffer through it. We're not going to see the coming wrath. So looking at all the things we learn about this church in this first chapter, there are some examples for us and maybe some questions we can ask ourselves about how we're doing compared to the Thessalonian church. This church had a really strong understanding of being rooted in their relationship with God, who chose them and who is their Father. Are we a community that is rooted in God's grace and our identity in Him? Are we living as the family of God? Is our spiritual family our primary community? Do we identify more with the world or more with Jesus? This church was committed to Jesus and living their faith. Are we a community that actively lives our faith and commitment to Christ? Statistically, if you look at the church as a whole in North America, the church is not all that different from the world in things like premarital sex and divorce and use of pornography. And that's really sad. That means that we are not living our faith as tangibly as we should be. This church is empowered by the Spirit. Is that true of us? Do we sense or pray for the power of the Spirit among us? This church shared the gospel powerfully, both in word and in life. How is our faith community sharing the gospel? Are we looking for opportunities? Are you stepping into those when God puts them in front of you? This church was characterized by faith, love, and hope. How about us? What do faith, love, and hope look like in the situation in which we're living in today? Maybe you can discuss that in your Zoom groups. That's one of the discussion questions. What are some rubber meets the road ways we can live those three things in 2020 in the middle of COVID-19? Our church is not defined by the messages given from the pulpit on Sunday or by the work of the staff or the pastoral team. It's defined by the Monday to Saturday living of each and every one of us, in how we behave and how we talk and how we interact. We are the church. We are God's voice. We are His hands and His feet. And in this time, we are the means by which the world will see Jesus. How are you talking about the current crisis? With fear? Do you sound like everybody else, imagining the worst possible scenarios, expressing anxiety? Or do you express calm and hope in God and faith in His sovereign power and love for those around you who need some hope and maybe some practical help during this time? I'm just going to end with a short illustration that I saw recently. There is a gravestone in the graveyard of an Episcopal church in rural Louisiana underneath a live oak tree. It's the grave of an elderly woman who instructed that her gravestone was to have only one word on it. Not her name, not the dates of her birth and death, just one word. Waiting. The church has given names to certain days on the calendar, and two of those days that we have named are Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Good Friday was a day of sorrow and loss and pain. Easter Sunday, a day of joy and hope and glory. But in between is a Saturday that doesn't have a special name. It's a day of waiting. A day of fear and sorrow for those who waited, but it was just a day of waiting. A day of waiting for the joy that would come on Sunday. We are in a kind of a cosmic day of waiting. Jesus is going to come back for us, and that will be a day of hope and glory and joy and the culmination of everything He has done for us and all that we're waiting for. But today is a day of waiting. We can't help having to wait. We have no control over the conditions of our day of waiting or how long it will be, but we do have control over how we wait. Thessalonians will help us to wait well, because Jesus is for sure coming again for us. How would it look for Him to find us waiting well? I hope you'll join your Zoom group and chat a little bit and share your thoughts and your prayer requests. Love you guys.